Hello and welcome. I'm the Big Shot Critic, and today we're going in depth with a movie I love dearly, The Fast and the Furious. It's easy to find in-depth reviews of Star Wars, Star Trek, James Bond, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, even Marvel movies. You can find entire channels dedicated to those. But Fast and Furious? Where's the love? You can't find in-depth reviews, and certainly not entire channels dedicated to it. So, this important task falls to me. When YouTube gave me access to the Community tab, the first thing I did was poll my viewers regarding The Fast and the Furious, and the viewers have spoken. Most of you don't care. Clearly, drastic measures had to be taken. The love of this movie must be known. If you don't want spoilers, go watch it and come back. If you're on the fence about spoilers, don't worry about it. For one thing, this movie is more than 20 years old now, and for another thing, I don't keep coming back to it because I forgot what happened. I keep coming back to it because I love the characters. And that's the first thing you should know. Unlike most of what we get these days, this movie is character-driven. Get it? Driven? I watched The Expanse about a year ago, and I stopped in season 3 or 4 or something. Did the quality of the writing go down? No. It's just I finally found out what the weird blue stuff was up to, and I didn't care anymore. It was the mystery that kept me watching. And when that was gone, I realized I didn't care about the characters at all. But with The Fast and the Furious, it's the opposite. The trailer for Fast X came out recently, and to be honest with you, it looks like a rehash of Furious 7, but I'm going to go see it anyway because I love the characters. And that love goes all the way back to the original, in 2001. Out of the top 10 highest-grossing film franchises ever, only 2 actually began with a movie. Star Wars and The Fast and the Furious. It kind of puts it in a new light, doesn't it? Well, how did that happen? Those of you old enough to remember will know that The Fast and the Furious was kind of a B movie. It wasn't meant to be anything special, yet here we are 20 years later with spin-offs, cartoons, video games, and the 10th entry on the way. Well, once upon a time, in a theater long ago, the house lights went down. The movie starts with 3 Honda Civics hijacking a big rig full of high-end electronics. Keep in mind that high-end electronics is a relative term that changes over time. And yes, that is a truck full of VCRs, TVCRs, and camcorders. You know, real top-shelf stuff. And I remember this stunt with the Civic underneath the trailer being all over the TV ads and trailers. That may seem tame now, but that was very talked about at the time, and it got a lot of people to the theater. Also, you get a mystery right away. Who was driving those Honda Civics? That's a big question for a large part of this movie, but really it's just a hook. The real central question comes later. Then we meet Brian. As a character introduction for Brian, this scene does almost nothing. It's really an introduction for Brian's Eclipse. It's green, it goes real fast, and Brian can't control it very well. Okay, now we meet Brian. And Mia, and Dom, and Letty, and Vince, and Jesse and Leon. Look, you've heard that these movies are all about family. That's literally been a meme for a few years now, so it's only appropriate that Dom's whole family is introduced all at the same time, as a unit. In this movie, he refers to them as his team, except Mia, of course, who actually is his sister, but we'll get to that later. This is one of my favorite scenes. Every time I see it, I love it, but it's like revisiting an old photo album. The memories come flooding back, but it feels older every time you dust it off. Brian orders a tuna sandwich from Mia. It's clear he's done this before. Dom is in the back, being an enormous screen presence, even with his back turned. Letty, Vince, Jesse, and Leon arrive. Letty is Dom's girl. Vince is adversarial and does not trust Brian. And Jesse and Leon kind of just round out the crew. The scene plays so naturally, like the actors are just playing themselves. The part that feels more and more dusty is the cars, which I promise looked really cool in 2001. and Letty's costume, which is literally just essence of late 90s grunge. But 90s grunge is coming back, I think, so maybe it's cool again. I'll ask my niece. Hey, quick question. Is 90s grunge fashion cool again?
I mean, a little bit. It depends on like the person's vibe.
What if they're like really hood?
It depends, and it depends on like aspects of it. Like I just like the '90s grunge. There's a picture of a guy wearing like a shirt that looks like three different.
Okay, that's fair. So it depends.
Why?
Oh, I'm recording a video right now, and one of the characters wears like this horrible 90s grunge costume. I'm thinking maybe it could be so awful 90s grunge that it might actually be back in now.
That's valid.
That's valid, okay. Alright, I'm gonna keep recording.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. So it depends. With the right colors, maybe. Anyway, a fight breaks out between Vince and Brian, and Dom has to break it up. And after telling Brian to leave, he tries to get Brian fired from his job at the Performance Auto Parts store. But instead of getting fired, Brian makes his boss install NOS on his green Eclipse. I've been fired from jobs before, and this never worked for me. NOS is short for nitrous oxide, which is a fuel additive that can temporarily boost the horsepower of your car by altering the combustion process. Now, I don't know how long it takes to install a NOS system on a car, but in the movie it's installed by that night. I'm guessing that's unrealistic, but we'll just go with it. After dark, the street racers start gathering for some races. The movie treats it like any sporting event, complete with tailgating. They're parked, they're waiting for the main event, and they're socializing. They're tailgating. A couple of side characters are introduced in the tailgating scene. There's Hector, who plays into the subplot about who is driving those Hondas, and there's Edwin, who is just a musician cameo. Hector actually shows up again in Furious 7, and we even get a little Hector in a flashback scene in F9. These little details for the more serious fans to enjoy are always a pleasure when you first see them, but they also enrich the original. It's like planting a tree and watching it grow, and each new branch and stem helps your appreciation for the seed where it first began. It's like a tree. Speaking of seeds where things started, Edwin is more than just a cameo. Yes, his character has a small part in the race, but that's not what I'm talking about. He's played by Ja Rule, and he's in the movie because he's in the soundtrack. Truth be told, he's an annoying character. He speaks about himself in the third person, but he paved the way for Ludacris to be in the second movie, and his character is great. I can handle a few minutes of Ja Rule because it means I get a few movies with Ludacris down the road. After meeting everyone, Brian gets into the race by betting his car. Now, throughout the franchise, Brian is sometimes called the Buster, and nothing illustrates that more than this. They line up to race, and it's just the perfect example of show, don't tell. This is everything we need to know about Brian. He's intense, he's there for it, but he's in so far over his head and so unprepared. And it's capped off by this amazing 3-part reaction shot. They start the race, and the camera goes through Dom's engine. And I'm going to stop you there for a moment. For some, this is a controversial shot. If you don't watch closely, it can look like pistons going up and down, which would be a problem because Dom's driving a Mazda RX-7, which obviously has a rotary engine with no pistons. But if you look closely, you can see that it is a rotary engine. You can see it more clearly in this previs version of the shot. But there are 3 rotors. Everyone knows the 13B REW motor that came with the RX-7 only has 2. Well, don't fret. Mazda also made the 20B and 13G engines, which came with 3 rotors each, and people actually put those in Mazda RX-7s for the added power. I know you guys were super worried about that, but don't worry, it checks out. You can put your pitchforks down. Okay, back to the action. For the race, which is only a half-mile drag, director Rob Cohen opted for this funny warp speed effect to try to give the impression of high speed. Let me be absolutely clear, it totally doesn't work. It's just the cheesiest thing. He stretches out what would be a 20-second race into like 2 minutes with all this stuff going on. I don't blame him for it because he's just trying something new, but it didn't work and the franchise never did it again. Thank goodness. So Dom wins and Brian spins out again like he did in the parking lot earlier. There's this insert shot of Brian after he lost, but he doesn't care. He's just hooked on the thrill and the speed, and his face says it all. Now that's important. We're going to get to that later. Of course, because he lost, that means he lost his car. And that leads to the famous gloating scene with Dom's famous line.
It don't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Winning's winning.
The extras here are actual street racers, by the way, and in this short scene, Vin Diesel is working that crowd for real. It's one thing to perform for a camera, but it's another thing to act against real street racers and still be convincing as king of the streets. Vin Diesel's screen presence is real. Right after Dom's little speech, the police close in and everybody scrambles. And you know what's awesome? Those real street racers brought their real cars. In this scramble scene, the extras are driving their own cars. I'm just guessing, but I seriously doubt the production told their insurance company about that. Rob Cohen said they ran this scramble 3 times to get all the shots he wanted, and not even a fender bender. Dom manages to park his car unseen after the scramble and plays it cool on foot, but the cops spot him almost immediately. This is another great example of show, don't tell. If this movie was written by modern Hollywood writers, every other line would be about how Dom is the king of the streets. Oh, he's the king of the streets. Dom is the king of the streets. But because it was written by actual writers, they show you. How did the police recognize him so quickly? Well, it's because they've all been briefed on him, because he's a high priority target for them, because he's the king of the streets. After a brief chase, Dom is picked up by Brian, who thought if he got in Dom's good graces, he would let him keep his car.
You are my good graces, but you ain't keeping your car.
They lose the cops pretty quick, but get picked up by Johnny Tran and his cousin Lance. You know, the one with the snakeskin pants.
Brian, meet Johnny Tran. The guy in the snakeskin pants, that's his cousin Lance.
Now let's slow it down a minute and catch up. At this point in the movie, Brian is just as confused as you might be. Who are these people? Why are they holding them at gunpoint? What is going on? But really, all this scene is doing is introducing more shady characters in the underground world who might be the Honda drivers from the beginning. After blowing up Brian's Eclipse for crossing into their turf, they let Dom and Brian go. Tough night. And when they get to Dom's house, they're chummy enough that Dom invites Brian inside. And that puts Mia in a tizzy. I think she likes him. Rob Cohen describes this movie as operatic, and I feel like that describes the first act in particular because this story has been getting pretty thick pretty quick. There's this teaser from the night before with the Honda drivers hijacking the truck, and then there's one long, unbroken day following Brian, spinning out in the parking lot in the morning, flirting with Mia in the afternoon, and this evening that still hasn't finished. And it introduces all of the characters in this underground world all at once. That's a very operatic thing to do. So if your head is spinning and you're losing track of what's going on, that's normal, that's intended, and Brian's long night is about to come to an end. When they go in the house, everyone is partying, and Dom pushes them about why they didn't come looking for him. Just when Dom is cooling off, Vince pushes back about why he brought Brian inside.
Why'd you bring the Buster here? 'Cause the Buster kept me out of handcuffs!
Letty calms Dom down and removes him from the situation. Then, just when Vince, Leon, and Jesse are closing in around Brian, Mia does the same thing for him. They chat for a minute and she drives him home. End of Brian's long night. Brian gets pulled over the next day and, twist of all twists, you never would have guessed, he's secretly a cop. What? Okay, so it's not that big of a surprise. Brian and his law enforcement friends have the same question we do. Who are the mysterious Honda drivers? With this new style I'm trying to go for with my channel, I'm trying to be less technical and focus only on what we love so much about these movies. But this scene does so much, so well, and so quickly, I'm gonna have to pull it apart just a little bit. First, it reveals the hierarchy. There's Bilkins, the FBI agent, Tanner, the local police sergeant, and Brian, the undercover officer, whose real name is Brian O'Connor, not Brian Earl Spillner.
Brian Earl Spillner. Sounds like a serial killer name. Is that what you are?
No, man.
Second, it reveals the dynamics. Bilkins can pass blame down the line to Brian when things go wrong. Tanner runs everything, but spends all his time keeping the peace, and Brian is the runt, at the bottom. Third, it reveals motivations. Brian puts up with all of it because he wants to make detective. Tanner is just doing his job and trying to keep the peace, and Bilkins is under political pressure. And finally, it reveals why Brian didn't get fired earlier, which is because his boss is an informant for the police department. This scene does all of that lightning fast while still being entertaining, and they even find time to land a couple jokes. Now, on the face of it, this scene is about the mounting pressure to solve the case about the truck hijackings. But in reality, there's a much more important reason for this scene, and we're going to get to that later. Now, because the green eclipse was blown up and Brian still owes Dom a car, the scene ends with Brian telling Tanner he needs another car.
Hey, Tanner. I'm gonna need another car.
Bilkins was just bellyaching about the eclipse being an $80,000 car.
That was an $80,000 vehicle, officer.
Hey, did you tell him what happened?
He knows what happened.
So that leads us straight into the Supra.
Whoa! Is that a Supra?
Dude, is it a Supra?
Because the last car got blown up, Brian is provided with a car, but it's all busted up and burnt out. It's got that precious 2JZ engine intact, though, so Dom agrees to accept it as the car Brian owes him, and they start working on it. For those of you who don't know, the 4th generation Toyota Supra is sort of a pillar of fast Japanese cars. I don't know that much about it, but I know it was already a legend back in 2001. The next couple of scenes are just Brian getting closer with the group, except Vince, who still doesn't trust him. Oh, and he lands a date with Mia. Now, I told you we'd come back to Hector. He pulls up at the Performance Auto Parts store where Brian works and orders parts for Honda Civics, 3 of everything, and he flashes some cash. Of course, Brian checks it out later, but no, wrong tires. They're running Pirellis. From an earlier scene, we know the hijackers are using Mashimoto ZX tires, which is a brand made up for the movie. Funny how real sponsors don't want to be associated with criminal activity. On his way out, Brian gets the butt of a shotgun to the head from Vince. He and Dom caught him snooping around. They interrogate Brian, and it's another scene where Vin Diesel shows his insane screen presence for such a young actor.
Brian, this is one of those times when you need to be very clear about what you say.
Brian quickly spins a story about checking out the competition for Race Wars, the upcoming racing event in the desert. And I don't know if Dom is trying to call his bluff or what, but he takes the whole crew and they go look in Johnny Tran's garage. Maybe he figures a cop wouldn't participate in breaking in another garage? And Johnny Tran has a bunch of high-end electronics stashed in his garage. Oh yeah, they also witnessed Johnny Tran being a psychopath for a few minutes with someone who tried to double-cross him.
Where are they, Ted? Where are they? Where are they? They're in the warehouse. They're in the warehouse, man.
Brian meets with his law enforcement buddies again, and Bilkins wants to move on Johnny Tran, but Brian says he wants more evidence first. When Tanner asks about Dom, Brian says he thinks Dom is too controlled to be doing these things, which makes Tanner show Brian some pictures of what Dom did to a man's face a few years earlier with a wrench. I wouldn't call it graphic, but it's not pretty, and this is a family-friendly channel, remember? Once again, on the face of it, this scene is a general recap of the plot. Here's what we're after, here's why we need to hurry, and here's who we think did it. But once again, the real reason for this scene is a little different, and I'm going to have to tease you on that one more time because we're not there yet. With Brian's date with Mia coming up, Dom opens up a bit to Brian. I guess he trusts him again after breaking into Johnny Tran's garage together. Why not? What he shows Brian is a little Toretto family history, the custom Dodge Charger that he and his dad built. The whole scene takes a surprising turn when Dom admits he's too scared to race the Charger. Then he tells Brian the story of how his father died in a race when another driver caused a fiery crash. This was a legit race, not a street race, and when Dom saw the other driver about a week later, he had a wrench in his hand. And that was the man that Dom beat with a wrench. And then he gives Brian the line that we've all heard.
I live my life a quarter mile at a time. Nothing else matters, not the mortgage, not the store, not my team and all their bull. For those 10 seconds or less, I'm free.
Now we're going to have to pause there for a moment for two reasons. The Fate of the Furious and F9. This scene is the foundation for both. When Dom says he lives his life a quarter mile at a time, he says that freedom is even more important than his team. Over the course of the movies, his attitude changes, but that old viewpoint he had is the crux of the Fate of the Furious. The villain tries to exploit that old view, and the fans can tell it's pulling a thread that goes all the way back to this scene in the first movie.
Why live only a quarter mile at a time when you can live your whole life that way?
And as for F9, it begins with the race where Dom's father died. And because I know the story so well, from Dom's description in the first movie, I almost immediately realized what I was about to see. And I was so excited. That was one of my favorite experiences in a movie theater in a few years. I wasn't excited to see Dom's dad die, but I was excited to see them get all the details right, exactly as Dom tells it in this scene. And they did get all of the details right. You better believe I was watching for it. Anyway, the events surrounding that crash form the backbone for the story of F9. And again, it all comes back to this scene from the original. Earlier I described the growth of this franchise like watching a tree grow. Well, that's 2 whole branches that stem from one scene in the first movie. And the whole franchise is built like that. It's like a tree. So Brian and Mia have their date, and as an undercover cop, Brian is doing pretty well. Mia is just spilling the whole history of the team. Brian's doing pretty well as a genuine love interest, too. Hey. But the mysterious Honda drivers strike again that night, and Bilkins decides to move on Johnny Tran. They go full force into his house and arrest him in front of his whole family, which brings the full fury of High Expectations' Asian father down onto poor Johnny. The dust settles that night, and the Tran crew are innocent. Bilkins threatens to pin the big mistake on Brian, who of course gets mad, but Sergeant Tanner keeps the peace, as usual. Believe it or not, Dom is not the first person in this franchise to mention family. It's Sergeant Tanner, right here in this scene. He tells Brian it's gotta be Toretto pulling these jobs. And Brian tells him Dom's not gonna go back to jail.
Well, that's a choice he's going to have to make. There's all kinds of family, Brian. And that's a choice you're going to have to make.
You know how I've been teasing you about what these scenes are really about? Well, that's it. These cop scenes are really about family. Specifically, what family Brian has chosen to be a part of so far. And look at it. It's a mess. There's constant infighting and backstabbing. Everyone's looking out for themselves, and they're barely held together by Sergeant Tanner. Compare that to Dom's family, where Brian has been spending most of his time. Do they fight? Yes. Do they argue? Yes. But there's loyalty, trust, there's a bond. I told you the mystery of the Honda drivers was really just a hook, because we all know it's gotta be Dom. Even Sergeant Tanner knows it's gotta be Dom.
It's Toretto, Brian. It always has been Toretto.
I told you we would also get back to Brian's little reaction shot after his first race. That was Brian's little hook into the racing world. The first question in his mind that got him wondering, what family does he really want to be a part of? So the real central question, the real heart of this movie, is what family will Brian choose? I wish I had a sponsor for this video, because this would be the perfect time for some kind of plug. Hogwarts Legacy. Pick up your copy today. And kids, don't do drugs. After all that heavy story stuff, it's time for something more exciting. And right on cue, the Supra is finished and ready for its first drive. I promise you those decals looked really cool in 2001. Brian and Dom pull up to a red light next to a Ferrari F355 driven by this tool bag.
What's the retail on one of those?
More than you can afford, pal. Ferrari.
This wouldn't be anything more than a slightly stiff performance from the Ferrari driver, except that is Neil Moritz, the producer of the Fast and Furious movies since the beginning. I always love it when a producer takes on a cameo as some random jerk or idiot, or both. Dom tells Brian to smoke him, and he does. After getting the job done against the Ferrari, Brian turns his attention to the other job he has to do. He starts pressing Dom about all the money he seems to have.
I know there's no way in hell that you paid for all that that's under the hood of those cars by doing tune-ups and selling groceries.
Brian is pressing his luck again in this scene, and Dom doesn't give anything away too easily. Instead, he just gives Brian directions to Race Wars. So, Race Wars. It's the showdown in the desert we've been hearing about. It's a big, legitimate racing event that takes place over many days and uses runways on a closed airbase as drag strips. Letty gets a quick win over some chump. Then Jesse races Johnny Tran and bets his car. Only it's not his car, it's his dad's car, who is in prison, and he loses. When Jesse freaks out and drives away, Tran confronts Dom about it, and aside from wanting the car, he blames Dom for the police arresting him in front of his family earlier. He thinks Dom tried to rat him out to the police for something and caused the whole scene. How do you think Dom reacted to that? Did you see that? He threw so much momentum into that punch, he had to take 3 steps back just to punch him some more. Play it again. I've never seen another movie punch do that, and it actually makes the punch feel heavier and harder. Night falls at Race Wars, and the racing gives way to dancing. And there's always that guy. You know, I used to go to a lot of dance parties, and there's always that guy. Brian overhears Mia arguing with Dom and sees Dom, Vince, and Leon drive away, probably to go hijack a truck. So he confronts Mia about it. Now here's where things start to move a lot faster. Brian levels with Mia. He tells her he's a cop and he's undercover and that he needs her help. I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but part of the time crunch for Brian to solve this case is that the truckers are up in arms. Literally, the truckers are arming themselves. So for the safety of her brother and her friends, Mia agrees to help Brian. The crew pulls up to the truck and starts their routine we saw earlier, but just before Vince jumps to the truck, Dom sees the driver has a shotgun and tries to bring Vince back, but it's too late. He ends up hooked on his safety cable and can't get free because he's too busy ducking and dodging shotgun shells. What follows is both hard to explain and much better to just watch it anyway, and I can't show you a clip that long on YouTube, so I'm telling you to go watch the movie after you watch this review. Whenever the other 3 drive close to the truck to get Vince off, they get shot at by the driver. And because of some maneuvers with the brakes, Vince gets his arm stuck in the safety wire and swings over to the passenger door of the truck. It's a really intense scene. And it's worth mentioning that they do that cool stunt again. Do you know that stunt was so popular and talked about at the time that Rockstar, the video game developer, ripped it off for their game Midnight Club 2. Isn't that funny? And the 2019 Fast and Furious spin-off, Hobbs and Shaw, did a little homage to the stunt. But back to the truck. When all 3 Civics are down and it looks like Vince has no one else, Brian and Mia show up in the Supra. Brian pulls some wild heroics and gets him off the truck, but he's in bad shape. So with Vince seriously injured and bleeding badly on the side of the road, Brian makes an important call. Dom, Leon, and Letty catch up to them, and with the severity of Vince's wounds, Brian has no choice. He calls in a life flight air ambulance and therefore reveals that he is a cop right there on the phone while Dom watches. Brian has this look on his face like he knows. He knows Dom might kill him with his bare hands on the spot. And Dom has this look on his face Like he might kill Brian with his bare hands on the spot. Brian is literally risking his life on this phone call to save Vince. And it seems to me that's why Dom didn't do anything. He respects that Brian put Vince's safety above his own. So the helicopter comes, they load Vince on, and Mia goes with Dom, leaving Brian alone. It's a nice moment that's really well directed, and it gives us, the audience, a moment to take things in before the finale. Brian follows Dom to his house and pulls up just as Dom is coming out with a gun. Come to think of it, I'm not really sure why Brian goes there. He says he didn't call the cops yet, but what's he gonna do, take Dom in on his own? I think he must have done it to confront his own doubts about what he has to do. You know, he wants to arrest Dom, but he doesn't want to arrest Dom. The only resistance Dom offers, and the only reason Dom hasn't fled the scene, is because he needs to go find Jesse, who is still missing and still owes Johnny Tran his car.
Brian, I gotta find Jesse before they do.
This just splits Brian's loyalty even more. Here he is trying to arrest this man who just wants to go and save his friend. Before things escalate, Jesse pulls up out of nowhere. Dom disarms to calm Brian down, and just as suddenly as Jesse, Johnny Tran and his cousin Lance show up. You know, the one with the snakeskin pants. And they are not playing nice this time. Jesse gets hit, and Mia and Dom go to him. It looks like he might be dead, but no one ever says.
Did Jet just die? You know, it was really unclear.
Meanwhile, Brian chases after the two bikes in the Supra. And Dom? It's time for Dom to unleash the Charger. Ooh. Brian does chasing for a bit, and one of the bikes manages to get behind him and is about to open up on him again when Dom cuts him off and knocks him down a hill. Without a second shooter to worry about, Brian deploys his marksmanship and takes down Johnny Tran. He looks pretty dead, but once again, no one ever says.
You know, it was really unclear.
Brian turns his attention to Dom again, and he follows him to a stoplight. He's more following than chasing. He doesn't know what he wants to do with Dom when he catches up to him, and Dom senses that.
On green, I'm going for it.
So Dom is finally going to drag race the Charger. I guess he's not sure if he's going to go to jail after this or what. Gotta do what you gotta do. His time as a free man might be short, so he's got to face his fears and wrap things up. This finale is already happening fast, but things start to go even faster here. Dom's Charger does a wheelie off the line, which is awesome, and a train is coming along those tracks that mark the finish line because, of course, there's a train. Both drivers decide to go for it. There's this slow motion speed effect that reminds me of Star Trek the Motion Picture. They beat the train. We get a little phew moment, and then this happens. Don't worry, kids. Dom is safe. He's just a little banged up. And there's sirens in the distance, coming closer. So with Dom slightly injured, unarmed, and without any real means of escape, Brian has come to his moment.
And that's a choice you're going to have to make.
Dom is a man at peace. He's faced his demons, and he's done his best to take care of his friends. He's not going to fight Brian's decision, whatever it is. And what do you think Brian will choose? Is it A? Nah, I'm just kidding. I'm just going to show you. He gives him the keys to the Supra. He lets him go. And that's the end of the movie, folks. Brian made his choice. But before wrapping this up, there are two little things I have to cover. One is that Mia asks Brian in the fourth movie why he let Dom go. He tells her that he thinks it's because in that moment he respected Dom more than he respected himself. Like I've been telling you, to be a part of the police family in the movie, Brian had to lie and betray people. But Dom's family was built on trust and loyalty and theft. The other thing is the post-credits scene. It shows Dom driving around in Mexico. Did he run there alone? Is he going to meet Letty? He mentioned traveling to Mexico with her earlier. We don't know. We just know he got away. So let's wrap this up now. What I wanted to do with this video was share my love for this movie. If you already love it, I wanted to spend time with it, talk about it, connect over it. And if you don't love these movies, that's fine. I'm not trying to persuade you. I just want to help you understand why this franchise is so popular and so loved. Honestly, it confuses a lot of people. A lot of people don't get that. I want to help you get that. It's not the best movie ever made. It's downright dumb in some places. It's horribly dated in other places. It's not even a good foundation for a franchise. But it's got heart. It's got something worthwhile to say. It's got great characters and awesome cars. It's about a scrappy bunch of car lovers making their way in the world with nothing but a bit of trust and loyalty to guide them. And that's what Fast and Furious fans are. We're not as widespread as Star Wars fans. We're not as well-read as Tolkien fans. But we're loyal to a franchise that, like Dom, does its very best to take care of its fans. Even if Fast X isn't as good as I want it to be, I will still know that they did their best. That's the trust that they've earned from me. And that is why we love The Fast and the Furious. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of today's video. I've never made a video like this, so I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and smash that like button to share your love of The Fast and the Furious. Bye-bye.